My name is Helena Beaumont. For the better part of my life, I was a professor of music theory and classical cello at Reed College, a life I shared with my husband, Julian, who taught literature. Our home, nestled in the green folds of Portland's West Hills, was a sanctuary of sound. It was filled with the resonant chords of my cello practice, the rustle of turning pages from Julian's study, the lively debates of our colleagues over dinner, and the bright, messy laughter of our son, Sebastian. Then, 12 years ago, the world fell silent. It wasn't a gradual fading, but a sudden, brutal severance. A viral infection, swift and merciless, swept through my system and took my hearing with it, leaving behind a profound and unnerving quiet. Julian had been gone 5 years by then, and the silence that followed my illness was a different kind from the one that followed his death. His absence had left a hollow space, but one still filled with the echoes of his voice, his footsteps, his presence. This new silence was an impenetrable wall. Our house, a sprawling craftsman with dark wood beams and wide windows that looked out onto a garden lush with rhododendrons and Japanese maples, became less of a home and more of a museum. It was a space I navigated by memory and sight, the vibrant life it once held now preserved only in my mind's eye. The quiet was not peaceful. It was a weighted blanket, smothering the subtle cues of connection, turning every interaction into a careful, exhausting performance of lip-reading and guesswork. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, one of those quintessentially Portland mornings where the sky was a soft, pearlescent gray and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. The envelope was plain, the return address for the Oregon Auditory Sciences Institute. My heart gave a strange, muted flutter. I knew what it contained, yet my fingers trembled as I slid a letter opener beneath the seal. The paper inside was crisp, the type formal. My experimental procedure, a combination of a new generation cochlear implant and auditory nerve regeneration therapy, was scheduled. Dr. Marcus Thorne and his team were ready. The clinical trials had shown an 85% success rate for full auditory restoration. The remaining 15% still regained enough to discern speech, to hear the nuance in a voice, to separate truth from the carefully constructed fiction of a lie. I didn't want the world back, not all of it. I didn't long for the chattering of jays in the garden or the distant hum of traffic on Burnside. I wanted to hear people. I wanted to hear my son, Sebastian. He called weakly, his face a placid mask on the screen of my tablet. His words were always slow, exaggerated, his smile a well-rehearsed gesture of filial duty. He was checking in on his mother, the fragile deaf woman rattling around in a house too big for her. Since my hearing loss, his visits had grown more perfunctory, his patience a finite resource he doled out in careful measure. He looked at me, but his eyes were always elsewhere, calculating, appraising. He was a man waiting for an inheritance, and he was managing me as he would a volatile stock, with practiced detachment and a clear-eyed focus on the long-term payout. I needed to know who he had become in the silence. I needed to hear the words he spoke when he believed I was a living portrait on the wall, beautiful and valuable, but inanimate and unhearing. I folded the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and tucked it away in the bottom drawer of Julian's old desk, beneath a stack of his treasured first-edition poetry books. No one would know. Especially not Sebastian. That evening, I told Sophia. She had been with our family since Sebastian was a boy, transitioning from housekeeper to caretaker to, in the long, quiet years, my closest confidant. She was setting a tray with tea and her almond shortbread in the sunroom, a space where the late afternoon light filtered through the ferns hanging in the window, casting dappled patterns on the floor. Her movements were economical and graceful, a quiet ballet I had watched for decades. I took out my small notepad, the constant companion of my silent world. "I have the surgery scheduled," I wrote. "Next week." Her hands stilled over the teapot. She looked at me, her dark, intelligent eyes widening. She didn't need to sign. I could read the question in her gaze. She took the pad and wrote beneath my words, her script a familiar, elegant cursive. "Does it work?" "They say it does," I wrote back. "But you cannot tell anyone. Not a soul. Promise me, Sophia." She met my eyes, and I saw a flicker of understanding, a deep, sorrowful wisdom that knew exactly why I was asking for this secrecy. She nodded, her lips pressed into a firm line. She placed a hand over her heart, a gesture of absolute fidelity. "You have my word, Helena." The porcelain teacup rattled softly as she placed it before me. I sat in the hushed warmth of the sunroom, the scent of bergamot and butter in the air, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself imagine the future. Not the sound of a cello, or the whisper of the wind through the tall Douglas firs in the yard. I imagined the sound of a voice, stripped of its performance, raw and real. I wanted to hear my son. The following Friday, Sebastian and Olivia came for dinner. They arrived just as the evening mist began to roll in from the hills, blurring the edges of the city lights below. Sebastian strode in with a blast of cool air and strange cheerfulness, wearing a sharply tailored suit that looked more appropriate for a boardroom than his mother's dining room. Olivia, his partner of 2 years, followed in his wake, a vision in beige cashmere, her smile as meticulously applied as her makeup. She leaned in to kiss the air beside my cheek, her perfume a cloud of expensive, synthetic florals. "Mother, you look wonderful," Sebastian said, his voice artificially loud, his mouth forming the words with theatrical precision. He thought volume was a substitute for clarity. "Sophia is taking marvelous care of you." I offered a serene smile and a slight nod, my pen already moving across the notepad I held. "It's so good to see you both. Dinner is almost ready." Olivia's eyes weren't on me. They were sweeping across the room, cataloging. I watched her gaze linger on the Gustav Stickley sideboard, the hand-hammered copper fireplace hood, the collection of original Northwest School paintings Julian and I had collected over a lifetime. She looked at my home not as a place where a life had been lived, but as an asset portfolio waiting to be liquidated. Sebastian placed a hand on my arm, a touch that was more for positioning than for connection. "We were just talking on the way over," he said, his enunciation painstaking. "This is such a big house, a lot for you to manage. We've been thinking, have you considered letting go of the beach house at Cannon Beach? The upkeep is a fortune. And perhaps we could look at consolidating your investment accounts. Make things simpler for you." I kept my expression placid, a calm lake reflecting a turbulent sky. Inside, a familiar ache tightened in my chest. "I will think about it," I wrote. "Let's eat. Sophia has made your favorite." In the dining room, the table was set with our wedding china. The aroma of rosemary roasted lamb filled the air. Sebastian, true to form, praised Sophia's cooking with booming enthusiasm, as if I could hear his approval through sheer force of will. Olivia was more reserved, sipping her Pinot Noir and contributing little beyond polite nods. The conversation, such as it was a monologue. Sebastian recounted his latest successes at Cascade Capital, the fluctuating markets, the difficulty of finding good talent. He would pause every few minutes to look at me, offering a condescending summary of what he'd just said. "The market is volatile, Mother. We need to be proactive with your portfolio." I nodded and smiled, a perfect portrait of genteel decline. After the main course, as Sophia was clearing the plates, I made a show of standing up to help. They both waved me back down, insisting I rest. I started toward the kitchen but paused in the archway of the dining room, just out of their line of sight, shielded by the thick velvet curtain that hung there. In the relative silence of my world, I had become an expert at observing, at being invisible. I watched their reflections in the dark glass of the china cabinet. Their voices were low, but their body language was a shout. "She's really fading, isn't she?" Olivia said, her mask of polite concern dissolving the moment she thought I was out of earshot. She gestured vaguely with her wine glass. "Did you see how she just stared when you mentioned the accounts? It's like she's not even processing it." Sebastian let out a long, weary sigh. He loosened his tie. "She won't be able to manage this place for much longer. We need to get power of attorney sorted out before she has a fall or something. Getting the properties transferred into a trust now would save us a nightmare of probate later. Especially the beach house. It's worth a fortune." Olivia swirled her wine, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "And the foundation Julian set up? The one for the university?" We need to make sure that doesn't lock up the bulk of the estate. I saw Sebastian nod in the reflection. He didn't look triumphant, just tired and pragmatic, as if he were discussing a necessary but unpleasant business merger. I stepped back into the dining room, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The rage I might have once felt had long ago cooled into a kind of crystalline resolve. They looked up, startled, their conversation cut short. I simply smiled and pointed toward the kitchen, then toward the dessert plates on the sideboard, a silent question. When they left an hour later, Sebastian performed the same ritual, a quick, dry kiss on my cheek. "Take care of yourself, mother. We'll call next week." I nodded and waved from the doorway as their car disappeared down the winding drive. Then I turned back into the warm, quiet house. Sophia was in the kitchen, wiping down the last of the silver. I walked to Julian's desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and took out the letter from the institute. I laid it flat on the polished surface of the dining table. In 6 days, the performance would be over. In 6 days, I would hear everything. The first thing I heard was not a voice or a piece of music. It was the low, electric hum of the fluorescent lights in the recovery room. It was a sound so mundane, so ubiquitous, I had completely forgotten its existence. It was followed by the soft, rhythmic beep of a monitor beside my bed and the gentle whoosh of the ventilation system. I lay perfectly still with my eyes closed, terrified that the slightest movement would shatter this fragile new reality. But the sounds remained, growing richer and more layered by the second. A door creaked open somewhere down the hall. I heard the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, approaching my bed. A voice, warm and calm, spoke my name. "Mrs. Beaumont? Helena? Can you hear me?" I opened my eyes. Dr. Thorne was standing beside me, his face, etched with kind lines around the eyes, was held in an expression of hopeful anticipation. I swallowed, my throat dry, and whispered a single word I had practiced saying in my mind for a week. "Yes." The sound of my own voice was a shock. It was thin and reedy, a stranger's voice emerging from my throat. It lacked the resonance and timbre I remembered, like a cello that hadn't been played in over a decade. But it was mine. I had spoken, and I had heard. Dr. Thorne's face broke into a wide, brilliant smile. "Remarkable," he murmured, making a note on a chart. "Absolutely remarkable. Most patients require a few days for the brain to adapt. There will be some swelling, and things might sound a bit metallic or distorted for a while as you reintegrate." I barely heard his clinical explanations. I was too busy absorbing the symphony of the mundane. The scratch of his pen on paper. The soft rustle of his starched white coat. The faint, distorted murmur of a conversation from the nurse's station. The world had come rushing back, not as a gentle tide, but as a flood, and I was determined not to drown. I would learn to swim in it again. Sophia arrived that afternoon, her arms filled with a bouquet of deep purple irises, her eyes already shining with unshed tears. She sat in the chair beside my bed, her hands clutching her purse. "It worked," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I nodded, the movement feeling momentous. "It worked, Sophia," I whispered back, the words feeling more real with each repetition. A tear finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "Gracias a Dios," she breathed, reaching out to take my hand. Her fingers were warm and strong around mine. "But remember," I said, my voice gaining a little more strength. "We tell no one. Not yet." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "But why? You can hear. Why would you pretend?" I turned my head to look out the window, where the persistent Portland drizzle was streaking the glass. I could hear the gentle patter of the rain, a sound I hadn't realized I missed so dearly. For 12 years, I have been translating their actions, reading their lips, guessing at their intentions, I said, looking back at her. They believe my silence is a weakness. They believe my deafness is a void. I'm going to let them go on believing it. It's the most honest view I'll ever get of who they truly are. Sophia's expression shifted from confusion to a dawning, fierce understanding. She squeezed my hand. "I understand, Helena," she said, her voice firm. "I will follow your lead. You just tell me what you need." The next day, I was discharged. They sent me home with a list of instructions: avoid loud environments, practice listening for short periods, be patient with the process. I had no intention of being patient. I had a house full of secrets, a son full of lies, and a voice no one but Sophia knew I had reclaimed. As we pulled into the driveway and I stepped out of the car, I could hear the click of the lock as Sophia turned the key in the front door. It was the sound of a key turning not in a tomb, but in a theater, just before the curtain rises. 2 days after the surgery, the house was no longer silent. It was singing. Every sound was a revelation: the sonorous tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, the groan of the floorboards on the landing, the whisper of my silk robe against my skin. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, relearning the acoustics of my own life. I kept the small, discrete processors of my implant hidden beneath my hair and turned to their lowest setting, a gentle filter that allowed me to hear without being overwhelmed. Sebastian called that afternoon. As she always did, Sophia answered the landline in the kitchen. I was in the study, the door deliberately left ajar, pretending to read. She brought the cordless phone to me, placing it on the desk with a subtle, conspiratorial wink. I picked it up, pressed the speakerphone button, and set it down, moving to a wingback chair just out of sight of the doorway. "Sophia? Is she there?" Sebastian's voice was crisp, impatient. "One moment, Mr. Sebastian," Sophia's voice replied, playing her part perfectly. Then a new voice, one I didn't recognize, came on the line. It was Sebastian's business partner, I gathered from the context. "Sebastian, the financials on the B portfolio are ready for the transfer," the man said. "Good. Just make sure the transaction is coded as a capital improvement disbursement for the coastal property," Sebastian instructed, his tone low and conspiratorial. "It's cleaner that way. No red flags. It's not like she ever looks at the detailed statements anymore. As far as the bank is concerned, we're renovating the deck." There was a short laugh on the other end. "Got it. And the power of attorney documents? My lawyer's drawing them up. Citing cognitive decline. It'll be ironclad. Just get the funds moved by end of day Friday." The line clicked dead. I sat motionless in the chair, the hum of the speakerphone filling the quiet room. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. There was only a profound, cold clarity. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was actively dismantling my life, piece by piece, while I was still living it. Sophia came back for the phone, her eyes questioning. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and wrote on my pad, "Thank you. I need to make a phone call." The next morning, I called Julian's old friend and our family lawyer for 30 years, Edward Sterling. I didn't use my landline. I used a new, prepaid cell phone Sophia had purchased for me. "Edward, it's Helena Beaumont." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Helena? My God. You're speaking." "Yes," I said calmly. "And I need your help. I need a complete, discreet audit of every financial account and property deed in my name. I suspect my son has been making unauthorized transfers." Edward, a man of few words and decisive action, didn't waste time with questions. "Understood," he said, his voice grim. "I'll start immediately." We met 2 days later in his downtown office, a quiet space lined with law books that smelled of leather and old paper. For 2 hours, I sat and listened as he detailed the preliminary findings. It was worse than I had imagined. Sebastian had siphoned nearly $2 million over 3 years, funneling it through shell corporations disguised as contractors and management firms. He had taken out a second mortgage on the beach house. He was in negotiations with a developer to sell our family home, contingent on securing power of attorney. "What do you want to do, Helena?" Edward asked, his gaze steady and compassionate. "We can file charges. We can freeze everything." "Not yet," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I had him draw up a new last will and testament. Sebastian's name was scrubbed from its pages. The house was to become a residence for gifted music scholars. The beach house was to be sold, with the proceeds funding a new music program at a local underserved high school. The bulk of my remaining financial assets would endow a permanent chair in Julian's name at the university. I created a small, modest trust for Sebastian, enough to live on but not enough to live in luxury, a final, painful lesson in value. Hold this, I told Edward, pushing the signed document across the desk. Do not file it until I tell you to. There's one more scene I need to watch. I left his office and stepped out into the bustling heart of the city. The sounds were overwhelming, the rumble of the Max train on the tracks, the hiss of a streetcar's brakes, the layered conversations of passers-by. But for the first time, it didn't feel like noise. It felt like life. And I was finally ready to rejoin it. That evening, Sebastian came by unannounced, with Olivia in tow. I was in the music room, a place I had avoided for years, sitting before the closed lid of my cello case. I heard their car on the gravel drive, the heavy thud of the car doors, their footsteps on the porch. Sophia let them in, her face an impeccable mask of neutrality. I heard Olivia's sharp, whispered voice from the foyer. Is she napping? Honestly, it's like visiting a mausoleum. Be quiet, Sebastian hissed back, his voice tight with an anxiety I now understood was not concern for me, but fear of being caught. She could come out at any moment. Oh, please, Olivia scoffed, her laugh a brittle, ugly sound. She wouldn't hear a bomb go off. You said it yourself, she's just a signature on a piece of paper now. Did you bring the documents? They're in the car, Sebastian muttered. I don't know, Olivia. Doing it here, in her own house, it feels wrong. What feels wrong is letting millions of dollars get donated to some dusty university department when it could be securing our future, she retorted. She had her life. It's our turn. Now, go get the papers. I leaned my head back against the cool wood of the chair, the silent cello case beside me like a coffin. I heard his hesitation in the long pause that followed, in the faint shuffle of his feet. It wasn't morality that gave him pause, but a weak, vestigial flicker of sentiment. It was a flimsy shield against Olivia's avarice and against his own. I heard him sigh, a sound of resignation, and then his footsteps moving back toward the front door. Sophia appeared in the doorway of the music room a few minutes later, her eyes dark with a quiet fury she held in check only for my sake. You have everything you need now, Helena, she said softly. The lawyer. The proof. You can make them stop. Why are you waiting? I looked at her, at the steadfast loyalty in her face, and felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost brought me to my knees. Because I know what he has done, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But I don't yet understand who he is. Was he always this person, or did my silence create him? I need to see him, all the way to the end of his choices. I need to give him one last chance to choose differently. Sophia simply nodded, a deep and sorrowful understanding in her eyes. She knew I wasn't just seeking justice, I was mourning the son I thought I had raised. The next morning, I called Sebastian on my regular phone. I let the phone ring 4 times before picking it up, fumbling with it as I always did. Sophia stood beside me, speaking my words for me into the receiver. Your mother would like you and Olivia to come for dinner on Saturday. A special occasion. There was a pause on Sebastian's end. I could hear the faint, tinny sound of his voice. Special occasion? What for? She didn't say, Sophia said smoothly. She just insisted on using the wedding china. I knew that detail would pique his greed. The china was only ever used for momentous family events. He would assume it was a precursor to a major announcement, likely the one he and Olivia had been orchestrating. We'll be there, he said. On Saturday, I asked Sophia to set the dining table not for 3, but for 4. She raised a questioning eyebrow, but did as I asked, laying out the heavy silver, the crystal glasses, the porcelain plates hand-painted with forget-me-nots. I chose a 1998 bottle of Domaine Drouhin Pinot Noir from the cellar, a wine Julian and I had saved, one I knew Sebastian coveted. From the music room, I put on a recording of Bach's cello suites, the very pieces I used to play for Sebastian when he was a child, turning the volume just high enough to be a soft, ambient presence in the house. I watched their car pull up. I saw them through the window, Sebastian straightening his tie, Olivia smoothing her silk dress. They were dressed for a coronation. They came in bearing a bottle of champagne, their faces wreathed in solicitous smiles. Mother, this is so lovely, Sebastian said, enunciating for my benefit. What are we celebrating? I smiled and gestured to the table with my notepad. Let's enjoy our meal first, I wrote. The dinner was a masterful piece of theater. I played my part, the frail, deaf matriarch, nodding and smiling vaguely at their loud, simplistic conversation. They spoke of their plans for a trip to Europe, of the new car Olivia wanted, all while their eyes darted around the room, as if mentally placing price tags on the furniture. After Sophia had served the flourless chocolate torte, Sebastian cleared his throat. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folio of documents, placing it on the table with a soft thud. "Mother," he began, his voice taking on a tone of grave sincerity. "We've had these papers drawn up. To help you. To simplify things. It's just a formality, to transfer management of the properties and accounts to me. It relieves you of the burden. Nothing will change for you day to day. We just want to take care of you." Olivia placed her hand on his, her expression a perfect sculpture of loving support. "It's what your father would have wanted, Helena. For you to be unburdened." I looked at the folder. I ran my fingers over the smooth, expensive paper. Then I looked up, meeting my son's eyes directly. They were watching me, waiting for the slow, confused nod, the reach for the pen. Instead, I let the silence stretch for a moment, the only sound the soft, melancholic melody of the cello from the other room. Then I spoke, my voice clear and steady in the suddenly still air. "Why such a hurry, Sebastian, to be burdened with what isn't yet yours?" The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Sebastian's jaw fell open. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. Olivia's hand flew to her mouth, and the wine glass she was holding slipped from her other hand, shattering on the hardwood floor with a sharp, explosive crash. The Bach sonata played on, a lonely, knowing witness. He stared at me as if I had risen from the grave. You can hear," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "For weeks," I said, my voice calm. "I've heard everything, Sebastian. The phone calls to your partners. The plans for the power of attorney. I heard you and Olivia in the foyer the other night. The jokes about my silence being like a mausoleum. I heard it all." Olivia was ashen, frozen in her chair, a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truth. Sebastian just sat there, deflating, the architecture of his deceit crumbling around him in real time. I reached out, pulled the folio of his documents toward me, and placed my hand on top of it. "Now," I said, my voice devoid of anger, filled only with a great and terrible sorrow. "Let's talk about what you've really been doing." Just then, the doorbell rang, its clear chime cutting through the tense silence. Sophia, who had been waiting in the hall, glanced at me. I gave a single, firm nod. "Let him in," I said. "He's expected." Edward Sterling walked in, his expression somber, his briefcase in hand. The final act had begun. Edward entered the dining room with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to walking into wreckage. He gave Sebastian and Olivia a brief, professional nod, his eyes betraying nothing. Sophia closed the front door softly behind him, the click of the latch echoing like a gavel. "I brought the files you requested, Helena," Edward said, placing his worn leather briefcase on the empty fourth-place setting. Sebastian's gaze flickered from me to Edward, a dawning horror spreading across his features. The carefully constructed world of his deception was being dismantled, board by board, in the very room where he had plotted its final triumph. I pushed my dessert plate aside and opened the folder Edward had brought. "For the last month," I said, my voice even and measured, "I have been a silent audience to a play of my son's own making. A tragedy of greed. Edward's audit has confirmed the script." I slid the top page across the table. It was a ledger, its columns neat and damning. "You've diverted $1.9 million from my accounts over the past 2 years, Sebastian. Funneled through shell companies you created. Capital improvements for the beach house that never happened. Portfolio management fees paid to an entity owned by Olivia." Sebastian finally found his voice, a reedy, desperate thing. "Mother, it's not what it looks like. It was strategic reallocation. To minimize tax exposure. It's complex. Is it?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Is it also a complex strategy to take out a secret mortgage on a property you don't own? Or to enter into a pre-sale agreement with a developer for my home, contingent on having me declared incompetent?" Olivia made a small, choking sound. Helena, this is a misunderstanding. We should discuss this privately as a family. I turned my gaze on her, and for the first time, she flinched. A family? I repeated. You called me a mute pet in a mansion, Olivia. You encouraged him at every turn. Your performance was flawless, but the show is over. You will sit there and you will listen. Sebastian slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. Please, he whispered, not to me, but to the space between us. Don't do this. You thought my silence was an absence, I said, the Bach cello suite swelling softly from the other room. You thought my deafness was an opportunity. You never considered that a person who cannot hear learns to see and feel and perceive with a clarity you can't even imagine. Edward pulled the new will from his briefcase and laid it on the table between us. This is my final will and testament, I stated. Edward will file it on Monday morning. You are removed as executor and as a primary beneficiary, Sebastian. I paused, letting the words land. My home will be gifted to the Portland Youth Philharmonic to serve as a scholarship residence for their top students. My music library and instruments will form the basis of their collection. The beach house will be sold, and the full proceeds will be used to create and endow a music education program for underprivileged children in the city. The remainder of the estate will go to the Julian Beaumont Literary Foundation at Reed College. Sebastian's head was in his hands. He looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and despair. You're cutting me out, he whispered. You're erasing me. I looked at my son, the boy whose first cries I had heard, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose heart I thought I knew. The anger was gone, replaced by a grief so profound it felt ancient. No, Sebastian, I said gently. You did that yourself. You sold your birthright for a handful of silver. This isn't a punishment. It's a consequence. I left a small trust, enough for him to start over, but not enough to continue the life he had been building on a foundation of lies. It was the last gift a mother could give her son, a chance to build something real. Edward slid a single-page summary of the audit findings and a notice of the pending legal actions to reclaim the stolen funds across the table to Sebastian. Then he closed his briefcase. I rose from the table, my body feeling lighter than it had in years. I turned to Sophia, who was standing by the doorway, her expression unreadable. Sophia, I said, please show them out. Sebastian didn't look at me as he left. He simply took the papers, his hands trembling, and walked out the door. Olivia followed, her high heels clicking a sharp, frantic retreat on the hardwood floors. The front door closed, and the house was quiet. But this time, it was a different silence. It wasn't empty. It wasn't heavy. It was clean. It was the sound of a space that had been cleared of ghosts, ready for new life to begin. Sophia came and stood beside me, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. We stood there together for a long time, listening to the rain and the cello and the peaceful, steady beat of my own heart. The days that followed were filled with a gentle, unfolding grace. I rediscovered my home, not as a silent museum, but as a living, breathing entity. I would sit in the garden and listen to the intricate conversation of the birds, the whisper of wind through the leaves of the great copper beech, the distant, comforting drone of a plane overhead. One afternoon, I found myself standing before my cello case. I hadn't touched it in 12 years. My fingers, once so strong and nimble, felt clumsy as I unlatched the case. The scent of old wood and rosin filled the air, a perfume of my former life. I lifted the instrument, settled it into its familiar place, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound was raw, uncertain, full of sorrow and rust. It was not the voice I remembered, but it was a voice. And as I played, falteringly at first, then with a growing confidence, I wasn't just playing for myself. I was playing for Julian, for the boy Sebastian once was, and for the woman I was becoming. I played until my fingers ached and tears streamed down my face, not tears of grief, but of a deep and cleansing release. Weeks turned into a month. I walked the city, a stranger in my own town, absorbing the symphony of it all. I sat in coffee shops, not reading or writing, but simply listening to the murmur of lives intersecting around me. The world was no longer a puzzle to be solved, but a song to be heard. Then one morning, Sophia came into the kitchen while I was having my tea, the local paper folded under her arm. She didn't say a word, just laid it on the table, open to the Metro section. There was a small article about a struggling after-school program at a public school in a low-income neighborhood. They had just hired a new, volunteer music instructor. I scanned the text and my breath caught. The instructor was Sebastian. There was a picture, grainy and small, of him in a poorly lit classroom. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a simple sweater, holding a battered-looking violin, showing a small child how to hold the bow. He wasn't smiling for a camera. His expression was one of intense, quiet focus. There was no mention of me, no mention of his past life at Cascade Capital. It was just a small story about a man and a group of children and a violin. I folded the paper and looked out the window at my garden, where the morning sun was finally breaking through the clouds, illuminating the dew on the rose petals like tiny diamonds. Perhaps this was the son I was meant to have all along. Not the heir to a fortune, but a man building a legacy out of something more valuable than money. Stripped of everything he thought he wanted, maybe he was finally finding what he needed. And maybe, just maybe, in the scraped, dissonant notes of a beginner's violin, he was finally beginning to hear, too.